Welcome to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Our guest today will be Corey Chavous of Draft Nasty as we talk about Vanderbilt quarterback Kyle Shurmur and the NFL Draft. Before we go to Corey, this podcast presented by Wellspire, Nashville's Learning and Development Center. Wellspire offers personal and professional development opportunities in a beautiful facility in the Gulch neighborhood. Stop by for an event with world-renowned speakers or host an off-site event that will wow your team or your clients. We thank our co-sponsor, the Well Coffee House, which turns coffee into water and has a mission to bring clean water to the world. Our news today presented by Sutherland and Belk, an SEC sports loving injury law firm in Nashville. These are folks who shoot you straight on your rights and options when you've been injured in an accident. Give Taylor or Russell a call. That number, 615-846-6200, to get your questions answered. You can visit them online at sbinjurylaw.com. The guest line is presented by our friend Josh Minton, who is an independent insurance agent operating out of Brentwood. If you need home, auto, motorcycle, renters, or landlord insurance, if you need insurance in the commercial realm as well, give Josh a call. You can reach him at 615-933-1979. Email him at josh@hqinsurance.com. Follow him on Facebook at jdmintonhq. He's my insurance agent. Give him a call. I think you'll be pleased. Corey Chavous joins us. He is a former Vanderbilt cornerback, former NFL defensive back, is outstanding at what he does at Draft Nasty, one of the premier draft analysts in the business. Corey, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, we have
some more players now.
Absolutely. Well, we had some unfinished business. I neglected to ask you about Kyle Shurmur, so that's the main topic today. Corey, lots of things to like about Kyle Shurmur. What are the things that you like the most?
Well, I think the number one thing is, he's just a very smart quarterback. I think that's something that whenever you're a coach's son and you come from a football lineage, those things are expected. And I thought he was given a pretty good amount of autonomy within the team's offense to be able to make some checks and do some things to get them in the right place. I think he's a pretty accurate quarterback when it comes to throwing option routes and really working in between the hash marks. He's got a pretty good feel for throwing back shoulder fades, to be able to maneuver the pocket and keep it on the field. I just think that's a bit inconsistent, but I think you've seen it on occasion. And I think you got to like, how he's played in some of the games that you would expect. There are more eyes on the football team. The Tennessee games in 3 straight years. I thought maybe the Notre Dame game was the best game of his career on the road against the college football playoff defense, and how he played in that game and put his team in a position to win. And I thought in that game he had quiet feet in the pocket. So there's a lot to like about him when he gets into a rhythm. He's a timing rhythm passer.
Corey, I saw him throw at Vanderbilt's pro day. Now, I didn't see all of it, but the part I saw, now look, there's no defensive backs, there's no pass rush, but man, his throws were great. He was deadly with the long ball that day. I don't know if you've been able to pick up on any buzz coming out of pro day, but what I have heard is that made a really good impression and seems to have boosted his stock a little bit. Have you heard anything along those lines?
No, and I for me it's this just in terms of I think what a lot of people at this point of the process have gathered, those things can help. In terms of being able to have a good pro day, I think that final impression means something. I do think his arm is probably not given enough credit because I think in terms of some of the throws he can make, they've been very impressive. I just think that sometimes, like I give you an example. What I mean by that, my final exposure to him was the 2019 NFLPA Collegiate Bowl. And dig over the middle of the field early in the first quarter. Then he threw a bootleg rollout, kind of a comeback rollout right on the money, but the receiver couldn't get his feet in bounds. And I thought he got his hips aligned on that throw. But again, some of the inconsistencies that you see, did show up at times in that game. He overthrew a crossing route that was intercepted. When he was on the deep, he looked potential in his 5 to 7 step drops. And we talked about having a pocket field sometimes where he hasn't always shined. But I think in this game, you can kind of see some of the stuff you saw against Notre Dame. He shook off the sack attempt on a flea flicker and then dumped the ball off to a running back, John Santiago, in the fourth quarter. So he's got some savvy.
Corey, let's talk for a minute about his mobility. I know that that's not going to be a staple of his game. Nobody's going to ask Kyle Shurmur to roll out or run read options or anything like that, but it is an issue in terms of escapability. Where does he stand as an NFL quarterback? Is he able to answer that question enough to be a productive player at that level?
Only times when you have a cloudy pocket, how you react. I think, like sometimes when you have a situation where the pocket is collapsed on you, suddenly does your decision-making change drastically. And I think that's where, that South Carolina game would come up when they were able to kind of get a bead with some of the things that they were doing, with some of the stunts they were running, the inside gut pressure. So I think that's where the ball security and stuff like that begins to become a little bit of an issue. I think his hand size is something that you've got to consider as well, depending on who drafts him. He's got NFL starter size, but his hand size is more like a backup because it's, anywhere between 8. So I think that's something that's a little bit of a concern. Not a big concern for me, but I'm just talking about how NFL teams have their check marks on certain physical characteristics.
Yeah, where does hand size come into play? Is that you're more prone to fumbling the ball if you've got smaller hands?
Well, you've seen it with him.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You've seen it with him. You've seen it on simple when it was raining, for example, against South Carolina. It was a simple shotgun snap, perfectly placed. I think it was by Della Ripa at the time, and Reagan was at guard, and it just goes right through his hands. Later on in that game, he lost a fumble on a relatively normal sack, and then Reagan had to make the tackle after there was a fumble recovery. So just that game alone, you want to put that video on if you're a scout because it's raining. So I think you have to kind of, look and see, how those things work for him. I think he has been in some environments and thrown the ball pretty well when it has chilly, though, or at least, a little bit, not 70 degrees. You've seen that late in the season. He's actually had some of his better games. So I think you got to take it with a grain of salt.
Corey, some quarterbacks fit better with some teams and systems than others. Where are teams that you think he fits well with what they do?
I think New England would be a good place. I think that's a place he could learn and develop in a backup role, potentially compete for a backup role. Systems like what the Jets were doing a year ago, I think some of that stuff. I don't think he's that bad throwing on the move legs and stuff like that. I think that's something that we talk about mobility. He's pretty accurate, throwing on the move. You've seen that. Now, I don't think he's as accurate when he's forced to move quickly and he has to make a throw. I think that's where he doesn't get his feet aligned. But, I think sometimes with he's got experience doing some of those different types of things. And the thing I like about him is that he has operated under censor a little bit. So when you project it from that point of view, I think the Giants and some of the stuff that they do, he's also operated in the shotgun. I think playing for his dad could be a possibility. I think he fits well with what they like to some of the concepts that they do in New York. But there are a number of teams that he would fit the styles of, in a sense, of thinking process in terms of how he's been able to go through plays that are similar to in the NFL. He's worked with NFL concepts, so he's pretty versatile across the league in terms of the schemes he can play in, because he's done some of the shotgun and zone read and RPO stuff as well.
Okay, the Giants would be an interesting landing spot because well coaching tenures in the NFL don't last very long. I think the father-son element obviously opens him up for some criticism alone. What would you think about that? If you're the Giants, would you just consider him as Kyle Shurmur as a name on the board, or is that something that you take into consideration that his dad is the coach there?
I think you made a good point. I don't know that would be a landing spot. I was more referring to it in terms of what, Manning is doing or has done within the system from what I've seen, and just some of the other systems that I've seen Shurmur run in the past. You can go all the way back to Cleveland. So that was more why I brought that up, but I don't know that would be necessarily a fit.
Let's talk the Titans for a minute, because there's always some crossover interest, being that Vanderbilt is in Nashville and a lot of the fan base is also Titans fans. Are there any guys that you see fitting well, particularly off the Vanderbilt team, guys going into this draft that might fit with what the Titans do?
One of the things that they've tried to, so far in free agency, address has been the offensive line. And they went out and got Roger Saffold. They re-signed Kevin Panfile, and they went out and they got Cameron Wake, edge rushers. The team will tell you what they need to strengthen by what they do in free agency oftentimes. And they also re-signed safety Kenny Vaccaro, but Ladarius Wiley is a Kenny Vaccaro type. So sometimes when you see the profile of a player, much like college teams, you'll see teams a lot of times recruit players who are within the profile of their current starters. Go through certain college teams, and you'll see that is how they recruit. And so I'll give you a good example. Deontay Thompson is kind of a clone of Eddie Jackson, who's currently a Pro Bowler, Chicago Bears, and I'm talking about Deontay Thompson at Alabama. So that's what I mean when I say that. But from a style perspective, Wiley is more like a Kenny Vaccaro in terms of how he plays. So that would be just a connection I'm making there. And I know that Wiley can play on special teams and have an impact. So now you're looking at him as a potential backup, and that just might be somebody that they could be looking at. They've got to get some help, continued help in terms of targets. They signed Adam Humphries in free agency. You'd believe, if you're a Titans fan, that Jonnu Smith can begin to take that next step and rebound pretty well from injury. So those are some of the things that the positions that they'll be looking at. I feel like they've done a pretty good job of strengthening one aspect, which is their offensive line. They got rid of Josh Klein, but they did sign Roger Saffold. I still think that they've got, some pretty good up front. They've got to get better in that area, because I thought it took them a while to get the running game going. Now, you could put part of that on, Henry just not getting it going, but I still think that if you look at some of the games that they had a year ago, the guard position was a position that they had to address and will continue to address. You might even think about the other guard position. I know you would say, okay, well, does Reagan fit in there? Possibly. I like it better as a center, but I thought they needed to go into free agency and address the guard positions, and they've done that. And by getting Saffold, that's an instant starter.
Corey, I'm going to give you the floor for final thoughts. Anything Vanderbilt related, or even Titans related, if you want to, that we didn't get to that you think is worth a mention?
Well, not really. I just think that in terms of this draft class, it's a deep draft. I've been doing this over 20 years, and this is one of the deeper draft classes that I've seen in terms of top to bottom talent along the offensive line. If you need to get an interior offensive lineman, I've got several centers like Eric McCoy from Texas A&M, Garrett Bradbury from NC State. I think those guys have, first-round type talent. We haven't even really, gotten into the guard position, but, you can look at a guy like Deion Calhoun and Mississippi State as a guy who's probably going a little bit underrated. I didn't mention Elton Jenkins from Mississippi State. And just from that position alone, I just named, 5 or 6 guys who I believe can come in and compete for starting roles. And then the tackle position is deep as well. You want to throw another guard in, Chris Lindstrom from Boston College, I think is a first-round talent. And then you start looking at tackle, Andre Dillard at Washington State, Cody Ford, guard, tackle, whichever one you want to put him. Caleb McGarry out at Washington is a high pick, in my opinion. Lamont Gallard from Georgia is another guy who I like at the guard position. I mean, you could just go on and on and on. We haven't mentioned Jonah Williams from Alabama. So there's just a lot of talent along the offensive line. Yadni Kajus at West Virginia, if you're looking for a guy maybe that'll slip a little bit, but is extremely talented and has had some injury issues. So that position alone, and we haven't even got, and I'm talking about offense. Remember, these guys will be pushed down. So if you're in the market for getting an offensive line, those guys will be pushed down because the defensive players in this draft, particularly along the defensive line and at linebacker, you've got a lot of high-end talent. They'll be available in the second and third rounds. And that is exactly why I tell you all the time when we talk, grades are sometimes insignificant because how the board plays out, you might have, 70 second-round grades. Well, some of those second-round grades, there's only 32 spots in the second round. So if you're in the third and fourth round, you might sneak up on a second-round grade depending on how you graded your specific board for a team. So that's what makes the draft very difficult to get drafted for these individuals because you could have a fourth or fifth round grade and you might be hoping to get a free agent contract because there's so many players, and if the talent is deeper, then some of those second, third, and fourth round grades will get pushed into day 3 of the draft. So that's how you have a third or fourth round grade, and you get all the way down into the 6th round. And there's so many players that I see every year that I grade that you just don't know, who's going to get drafted. 255 spots, 270 draft picks. I mean, you don't think there's more than 270 guys that have draftable grades? Of course there are. And I think that's what makes the draft so unique.
Well, speaking of unique, your publication is unique. I know that will be hitting newsstands in the coming weeks. Tell folks where they can pick up your draft guide and anything else that that you are associated with that you want to promote, Corey.
Yeah, we got a pretty interesting story right now at draftnastymagazine.com, and that's where you can pick up the draft book this year. And that story is actually on the Barton gene, talking about Cody Barton, a linebacker from Utah, whose brother, Jackson, is also an NFL prospect. And his mother, Mickey, she was an all-WAC basketball player, volleyball player. Their dad was also a football and baseball player. Their sister is a conference volleyball player. So the family gene of the Bartons is pretty amazing. And it was a story that we really got into at Draft Nasty, just kind of chronicling what Cody's done and his relationship with Chase Hansen, another linebacker who will get drafted from Utah. So that's a pretty good story. Also got a good story on Matt Gay over there, who's probably one of the best kickers in this year's draft, former soccer player who transitioned and took a chance. Was at Utah Valley as a soccer player. He took a chance and said, I'm just going to try football. And all he did was win the Lou Groza Award in 2017. So those are a couple of stories. The Fresno State wide receiver, Keyshawn Johnson. That's right, there's another Keyshawn Johnson in the draft. Didn't have great testing workouts, but back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons. Kind of talk about the Fresno State tradition at wide receiver. That's another really good story on our website right now. So a lot of stuff that we're doing that just kind of tell some stories before the draft. And our publication will have a lot of good, Q&As in it. Again, a glossary of terms if you don't know some of the terms we're using, prospect profiles of 700 players, and an NFL free agency recap of some of those guys we just talked about, like the Titans signed. So it's a really interesting book. We put a lot of work into it. Can't wait for it to be completed. I'm ready to get it off my plate, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I know the work you put into it. You do a tremendous job. If you are a draft nut, football nut, whatever, you need to buy the book. Hey, Corey, thanks for joining us. We'll do this again sometime soon.
Thanks a lot, Chris, man. You have a great week and great weekend, and I appreciate the time.